I mean, so Portugal does have it has a strategy for regional cohesion, and as part of that, you have both national policies and local policies supported either by LEADER if it's in rural areas, or some of the cohesion funding instruments, right? So those all feed into the national strategy for regional cohesion. So I guess that's how I would link it in my national context to spatial justice, or a deliberate way to trying to promote more spatial justice through policy making. Now, the question is, I'm unsure whether I should relate spatial justice in terms of the wanted or the desired outcomes. So, like whether the outcomes that are more equally spread geographically, or if the rules of the game, so the more procedural element, is a fair play. So if each different region, in principle, can have an equal right to access different resources, because it's different, right? So that's what I meant, not knowing how to see the spatial justice, if it's in terms of the outcomes or the... Because one thing is whether you set up rules that make sure that everyone, regardless of where they live, gets access to exactly the same resources, same services like school, health services, regardless of where they live. Which at the moment doesn't happen because, in some areas the population is very low, so they close schools and children have to go much further away to go to the nearest school. So that's not spatial justice at a starting point. And hence, there will be no spatial justice at the end point in terms of when you look at then the average educational level of different people. They will be more likely to have higher education if they were, for example, in an urban area, because they could access. Okay, so, but in the national context, I think that's at least how I would relate it. I would relate it more in terms of the strategy. There's the national strategy for cohesion, regional cohesion, and then underlying that you have different measures and instruments at more regional or more local level. And the European policies feed into this strategy at different levels. I think, I don't know, because that possibly would depend on each person, so I can only speculate about what I think people would say. But they probably would, on a first instance, assume that it has to do with whether the opportunities you have access to in a given region are more or less the same as someone else in a different region. So I think that would be perhaps the most intuitive way of feeling it, right? So that you're not spatially discriminated, sort of. What does the concept of spatial justice allow you to grasp that other concepts that usually don't? In other words, what's the rationale for using spatial justice as a concept? A contrario, what are the limits to this concept? But inequality in itself doesn't have a spatial element, I guess, right? So it could be only social, or regardless, it wouldn't have the geographical element. That you can't really separate the geographical element from other elements that, although they might not be, they are embedded in the space, even if they are not really. I mean, it's like territorial cohesion or like place-based approaches. It's not like the local is different from the localism, right? It's not that we're saying that you need to have the interventions at a very localized level just because it's the closer to the people, but it's rather that you involve and you engage the various local actors because they will have, in principle, better knowledge about the local dynamics. So in a way, the spatial doesn't have to be limited only to the physical definition, I guess. I guess for me, perhaps, this is how I view spatial justice anyway. The limit might actually be that it might have focused too much on the physical element, right? Because it says spatial justice. So it's as if it has a very direct focus on space, on the geography, and that might actually hide other elements that are actually embedded with the spatial element, but are not necessarily Well, the interesting thing about them is not necessarily the space. I mean, but, so say for example, if you have a policy of improving efficiency of educational resources, right? So then you basically decide that you want to close some schools in the more sparsely populated areas. Obviously, that's going to have a spatial impact because the people living in the more sparsely populated areas are going to have less access to schools. So there's obviously a spatial consequence, but the policy itself, the problem with it, if you wanted to avoid, to prevent the spatial impacts it has, the way to try and change the policy wouldn't necessarily have to have a spatial element to it, I guess. You see what I mean? So you could... it's difficult to explain. But I guess my point is, the limit to the concept might be too much of a focus on the spatial element itself, which is... So it's a bit like the place-based approach. What you really want to have is make sure that you involve the different actors that operate at different levels.